Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Today I'll be speaking with Stuart Russell. He is a professor of computer science and engineering at UC Berkeley. He's also an adjunct professor of neurological surgery at UC San Francisco. He is the author of the most widely read textbook on the subject of AI, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. And over the course of these 90 minutes or so, we explore the topics that you may have heard me raise in my TED Talk. Anyway, Stuart is an expert in this field and a wealth of information, and I hope you find this conversation as useful as I did. I increasingly think that this is a topic that will become more and more pressing every day, and if it doesn't, for some reason, it will only be because scarier things have distracted us from it. So things are going well if we worry more and more about the consequences of AI, or so it seems to me. And now I give you Stuart Russell. I'm here with Stuart Russell. Stuart, thanks for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
Our listeners should know you've been up nearly all night working on a paper relevant to our topic at hand. So double thank you for doing this.
No problem. I hope I will be coherent.
Well, you've got now nearly infinite latitude not to be. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what you do. How do you describe your job at this point?
So I'm a professor at Berkeley, a computer scientist, and I've worked in the area of artificial intelligence for about 35 years now, starting with my Ph.D. at Stanford. For most of that time, I've been what you might call a mainstream AI researcher. I work on machine learning and probabilistic reasoning, planning, game playing, all the things that AI people work on. And then the last few years, although this has been something that's concerned me for a long time, I wrote a textbook in 1994 where I had a section of a chapter talking about what happens if we succeed in AI, meaning what happens if we actually build machines that are more intelligent than us. What does that mean? So that was sort of an intellectual question, and it's become a little bit more urgent in the last few years as progress is accelerating and the resources going into AI have grown enormously. So I'm really asking people to take the question seriously. What happens if we succeed?
As you know, I've joined the chorus of people who really in the last 2 years have begun worrying out loud about the consequences of AI or the consequences of us not building it with more or less perfect conformity to our interests. And one of the things about this chorus is that it's mostly made up of non-computer scientists, and therefore people like myself or Elon Musk or even physicists like Max Tegmark and Stephen Hawking are seemingly dismissed with alacrity by computer scientists who are deeply skeptical of these worried noises we're making. And now you are not so easily dismissed because you have the really the perfect bona fides of a computer scientist. So I want to get us into this territory, and I actually want, I don't actually know that you are quite as worried as I have sounded publicly. So if there's any difference between your take and mine, that would be interesting to explore. But I also want us to at some point, I'd like you to express the soundest basis for this kind of skepticism that that we are crying wolf in a way that is unwarranted. But before we get there, I just want to ask you a few questions to get our bearings. The main purpose here is also just to educate our listeners about what artificial intelligence is and what its implications are, whether if everything goes well or if everything goes less than well. So a disarmingly simple question here at first.
Mm-hmm.
What is a computer?
Well, so pretty much everyone these days has a computer, but doesn't necessarily understand what it is. The way it's presented to the public, whether it's your smartphone or your laptop, is something that runs a bunch of applications, and the applications do things like, edit Word documents, allow face-to-face video chat and things like that. And what people may not understand is that a computer is a universal machine, that any process that can be described precisely can be carried out by a computer, and every computer can simulate every other computer. And this property of universality means that that intelligence itself is something that a computer can, in principle, emulate. And this was realized, among other people, by Ada Lovelace in the 1850s when she was working with Charles Babbage. They had this idea that the machine they were designing might be a universal machine, although they couldn't define that very precisely. And so the immediate thought is, well, if it's universal, then it can carry out the processes of intelligence, as well as ordinary mechanical calculations. So a computer is really anything you want that you can describe precisely enough to turn into a program.
So relate the concept of information to that. These sound like very simple questions, but these are, disconcertingly deep questions, I'm aware.
I think everyone understands that out there is a world, the real world, and we don't know everything about the real world. So it could be one way or it could be another. In fact, there's a gazillion different ways the world could be. All the cars that are out there parked could be parked in different places and I wouldn't even know it. So there are many, many ways the world could be. And information is just something that tells you a little bit more about what the world is, which way is the real world out of all the possibilities that it could be. And as you get more and more information about the world, typically we get it through our eyes and ears, and increasingly we're getting it through the internet. Then that information helps to narrow down the ways that the real world could be. And Shannon, who was a electrical engineer at MIT, figured out a way to actually quantify the amount of information. So if you think about a coin flip, if I can tell you which way that coin is going to come out, heads or tails, then that's one bit of information, and so that gives you the answer for a binary choice between two things. And so from information theory, we have wireless communication, we have the internet, we have all the things that allow computers to talk to each other through the physical medium. So information theory has been, in some sense, the complement or the handmaiden of computation, and allowing the whole information revolution to happen.
Now, is there an important difference between what you just described, computers and the information they process, and minds? Let's leave consciousness aside for the moment, but if I asked you, what is a mind, would you have answered that question differently?
So I think I would, because the word mind carries with it this notion, as you say, of consciousness. It's not with the word mind, you can't really put aside the notion of consciousness.
Except if you're talking about the unconscious mind, like all the unconscious cognitive processing we do, does mind seem a misnomer there without consciousness?
It might. Yeah, unconscious mind is kind of like saying artificial grass. It isn't grass, but it kind of is like grass. So just to give you a quote, John Hoagland has written a lot about AI. He's a philosopher, and he describes the notion of strong AI, as it used to be called, as building machines with minds in the full and literal sense. So the word mind there is really carrying the idea that there is true conscious awareness, true semantic understanding, and perceptual experience. And I actually think this is an incredibly important thing, because without that, nothing has moral value. there are lots of complicated physical processes in the universe, stars exploding and rivers and, glaciers melting and all kinds of things like that. But none of that has any moral value associated with it. The things that generate moral value are things that have conscious experience. So it's a really important topic, but AI has nothing to say about it whatsoever.
Well, not yet. I guess so that we're going to get there in terms of if consciousness is at some level just an emergent property of information processing, if in fact that is the punchline at the back of the book of nature, well, then we need to think about the implications of building conscious machines, not just intelligent machines. But you introduced a term here which we should define. You talked about strong versus weak AI, and I guess the more modern terms are narrow versus general artificial intelligence. Can you define those for us?
Right. So the word strong and weak have actually changed their meaning over time. So strong AI was, I believe, a phrase introduced by John Searle in his Chinese room paper, or it may have been slightly earlier than that. But what he meant was the version of AI that says that if I build something with human level intelligence, then in all probability it's going to be a conscious device, that the functional properties of intelligence and consciousness are inseparable. And so strong AI is the sort of the super ambitious form of AI, and weak AI was about building AI systems that have capabilities that you want them to have, but they don't necessarily have the consciousness or the first person experience. So that, and then I think there's been a number of people, both inside and outside the field, sort of using strong and weak AI in various different ways. And now, largely, you will see strong AI and sometimes general AI or artificial general intelligence to mean building AI systems that have the capabilities comparable to or greater than those of humans, without any opinion being given on whether there's consciousness or not. And then narrow AI, meaning AI systems that don't have the generality. They might be very capable, like AlphaGo is a very capable Go player, but it's narrow in the sense that it can't do anything else. So we don't think of it as general purpose intelligence.
Right.
And given that consciousness is something that we just don't have a philosophical handle, let alone a scientific handle on, I think for the time being, we'll just have to put it to one side. And the discussion is going to have to focus on capabilities, on the functional properties of intelligent systems.
Well, there's this other term one hears in this area, which strikes me as a term that names almost nothing possible, but it's human level AI. And that is, it's often put forward as kind of the nearer landmark to superintelligent AI or something that's beyond human. But it seems to me that even our narrow AI at this point, the calculator in your phone or anything else that gets good enough for us to dignify it with the name intelligence, very quickly becomes superhuman even in its narrowness. So the phone is a better calculator than I am or will ever be. And if you imagine building a system that is a true general intelligence, its learning is not confined to one domain as opposed to another, but it's much more like a human being in that it can learn across a wide range of domains without having the learning in one domain degrade its learning in another. You very quickly, if not immediately, we'll be talking about superhuman AI, because presumably this system it's not going to be a worse calculator than my phone, right? It's not going to be a worse chess player than Deep Blue. It's not, at a certain point, it's going to very quickly be better than humans at everything it can do. So is human level AI a mirage, or is there some serviceable way to think about that concept?
So I think human level AI is just a notional goal. And I basically agree with you that if we can achieve the generality of human intelligence, then we will probably exceed on many dimensions the actual capabilities of humans. So there are things that humans do that we really have no idea how to do yet. For example, what humans have done collectively in terms of creating science, we don't know how to get machines to do something like that. I mean, we can imagine that theoretically it's possible. It's somewhere in the space of programs there exists a program that could be a high quality scientist, but we don't know how to make anything like that. So it's possible that we could have human level capabilities on sort of on all the mundane intellectual tasks that don't require these really creative reformulations of our whole conceptual structure that happen from time to time in science. And this is sort of what's happening already, right? I mean, in as you say, in areas where computers become competent, they quickly become super competent. And so we could have super competence across all the mundane areas, like the ability to read a book and answer sort of the kinds of questions that an undergraduate could answer by reading a book. We might see those kinds of capabilities, but it might be then quite a bit more work, which we may not learn how to do, to get it to come up with the kinds of answers that a truly creative and deep thinking human could do from looking at the same material. But this is something that at the moment is very speculative. I mean, what we do see is the beginning of generality. So you'll often see people in the media claiming, oh, well, computers can only do what they're programmed to do. They're only good at narrow tasks. But when you look at, for example, DQN, which was Google DeepMind's first system that they demonstrated, so this learned to play video games, and it learned completely from scratch. So it was like a newborn baby opening its eyes for the first time. It has no idea what kind of a world it's in. It doesn't know that there are objects or that things move or there's such a thing as time or good guys and bad guys or cars or roads or bullets or spaceships or anything, just like a newborn baby. And then within a few hours of messing around with the video game, essentially through a camera, so it's really just looking at the screen. It doesn't have direct access to the internal structures of the game at all. It's looking at the screen.
Very much the way a human being is interfacing with a game.
Yeah, exactly. The only thing it knows is that it wants to get more points. So within a few hours, it's able to learn a wide range. So most of the games that Atari produced, it reaches a superhuman level of performance in a few hours, entirely starting from nothing.
And it's important to say that it's the same algorithm playing all the games. This is not like Deep Blue that is the best chess player, but he can't play tic-tac-toe and will never play tic-tac-toe. This is a completely different approach. Yeah.
Yep. This is one algorithm. It could be a driving game, it could be Space Invaders, it could be Pac-Man, it could be undersea, Sequest with submarines. So in that sense, when you look at that, if your baby did that, woke up, the first day in the hospital, and by the end of the day was beating everyone, beating all the doctors at Atari video games, you'd be pretty terrified. So, and it's demonstrating generality up to a point, right? There are certain characteristics of video games that don't hold for the real world in general. One of the main things being that in a video game, the idea is that you can see everything on the screen. But in the real world, at any given point, there's tons of the real world that you can't see. But it still matters. And then also with video games, they tend to have very short horizons because you're supposed to, play them in the pub when you're drunk or whatever. So they typically, unlike chess, they don't require deep thought about the long-term consequences of your choices. So, but other than those two things, which are certainly important, something like DQN and various other reinforcement learning systems are beginning to show generality. And we're seeing with the work in computer vision that the same basic technology, the convolutional deep networks, and with their recurrent cousins, that these technologies with fairly small modifications, not really conceptual changes, just sort of minor changes in the details of the architecture, can learn a wide range of tasks to an extremely high level, including recognizing thousands of different categories of objects in photographs, doing speech recognition, learning to even write captions for photographs, learning to predict what's going to happen next in a video, and so on and so forth. So I think we're arguably, if there is going to be an explosion of capabilities that feeds on itself, I think we may be seeing the beginning of it.
Mm. Now, what are the implications with respect to how people are designing these systems? So if I'm not mistaken, most, if not all of these deep learning approaches, or more generally machine learning approaches, are essentially black boxes in which you can't really inspect how the algorithm is accomplishing what it is accomplishing. Is that the case? And if so, or wherever it is the case, are there implications there that we need to be worried about, or is that just a novel way of doing business which doesn't raise any special concerns?
Well, I think it raises two kinds of concerns. One, maybe three. So one is a very, very practical problem that when it's not working, you really don't know why it's not working. And there is a certain amount of blundering about in the dark. Some people call this graduate student descent, that's a very nerdy joke. So gradient descent is, or walking down a hill is a way to find the lowest point.
Right.
And so graduate student descent, meaning that you're trying out different system designs, and in the process you're using up graduate students at a rapid rate. And that's clearly a drawback. And in my research, I've generally favored techniques where the design of the system is derived from the characteristics of the problem that you're trying to solve. And so the function of each of the components is clearly understood, and you can show that the system is going to do what it's supposed to do for the right reasons. And the black box approach, there are people who just seem to have great intuition about how to design the architecture of these deep learning networks so that they produce good performance. I think there are also practical questions from the legal point of view, that there are a lot of areas, for example, medical diagnosis or treatment recommendations, recommending for or against parole for prisoners, approving credit or declining credit applications, where you really want a clear explanation of why the recommendation is being made. And without that, people simply won't accept that the system is used. And in some, and one of the reasons for that is that a black box could be making decisions that are biased, racially biased, for example, and without the ability to explain itself, then you can't trust that the system is unbiased. And then there's a third set of reasons, which I think is what's behind your question, about why we might be concerned with systems that are entirely black box, that since we can't understand how the system is reaching its decisions or what it's doing, that gives us much less control. So as we move towards more and more capable and perhaps general intelligence systems, the fact that we really might have no idea how they're working or what they're thinking about, so to speak, that would give you some concern, because then one of the reasons that the AI community often gives for why they're not worried, right? So the people who are skeptical about there being a risk is that, well, we design these systems, obviously we would design them so that they did what we want. But if they are completely opaque black boxes that you don't know what they're doing, then that that sense of control and safety disappears.
Well, let's talk about that issue of what Bostrom called the control problem. I guess we could call it the safety problem as well. And this is, many people listening will have watched my TED Talk where I spend 14 minutes worrying about this, but just perhaps you can briefly sketch the concern here. What is the concern about general AI getting away from us? How do you articulate that?
So you mentioned earlier that this is a concern that's been articulated by non-computer scientists. And Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, was certainly instrumental in bringing it to the attention of a wide audience, people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and so on. But the fact is that these concerns have been articulated by the central figures in computer science and AI. So I'm actually
going back to I.J. Good and von Neumann.
Well, and Alan Turing himself.
Right.
So a lot of people may not know about this, but I'm just going to read a little quote. So Alan Turing gave a talk on BBC Radio 3 in 1951. So he said, if a machine can think, it might think more intelligently than we do. And then where should we be? Even if we could keep the machines in a subservient position, for instance, by turning off the power at strategic moments, we should, as a species, feel greatly humbled. This new danger is certainly something which can give us anxiety. So that's a pretty clear, if we achieve superintelligent AI, we could have a serious problem. Another person who talked about this issue was Norbert Wiener. So Norbert Wiener was one of the leading applied mathematicians of the 20th century. He was the founder of a good deal of modern control theory and automation. He's often called the father of cybernetics. So he was concerned because he saw Arthur Samuel's checker playing program in 1959, learning to play checkers by itself, a little bit like the DQN that I described learning to play video games. But this is 1959, so more than 50 years ago, learning to play checkers better than its creator. And he saw clearly in this the seeds of the possibility of systems that could outdistance human beings in general. So, and he was more specific about what the problem is. So Turing's warning is, in some sense, the same concern that gorillas might have had about humans if they had thought, a few million years ago when the human species branched off from the evolutionary line of the gorillas. If the gorillas had said to themselves, should we create these human beings, right? They're going to be much smarter than us. It kind of makes me worried, right? And they would have been right to worry, because as a species, they sort of completely lost control over their own future, and humans control everything that they care about. So Turing is really talking about this general sense of unease about making something smarter than you. Is that a good idea? And what Wiener said was this: if we use to achieve our purposes a mechanical agency with whose operation we cannot interfere effectively, we had better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire. So this is 1860. Nowadays, we call this the value alignment problem. How do we make sure that the values that the machine is trying to optimize are, in fact, the values of the human who is trying to get the machine to do something, or the values of the human race in general? And so Wiener actually points to the Sorcerer's Apprentice story as a typical example of when you give a goal to a machine, in this case, fetch water, if you don't specify it correctly, if you don't cross every T and dot every I and make sure you've covered everything, then the machines, being optimizers, they will find ways to do things that you don't expect. And those ways may make you very unhappy. And this story goes back, to King Midas, 500 and whatever BC, where he got exactly what he said, which is everything turns to gold. which is definitely not what he wanted. He didn't want his food and water to turn to gold or his relatives to turn to gold, but he got what he said he wanted. And all of the stories with the genies, the same thing, right? You give a wish to a genie, the genie carries out your wish very literally, and then the third wish is always, can you undo the first two because I got them wrong? And the problem with superintelligent AI is that you might not be able to have that third wish,
or even a second wish.
Yeah. So if you get it wrong, and you might wish for something very benign sounding, like could you cure cancer? But if you haven't told the machine that you want cancer cured, but you also want human beings to be alive, so a simple way to cure cancer in humans is not to have any humans. A quick way to come up with a cure for cancer is to use the entire human race as guinea pigs for millions of different potential drugs that might cure cancer. So there's all kinds of ways things can go wrong, and we have governments all over the world try to write tax laws that don't have these kinds of loopholes, and they fail over and over and over again. And they're only competing against ordinary humans, tax lawyers and rich people, and yet they still fail despite there being billions of dollars at stake. So our track record of being able to specify objectives and constraints completely so that we are sure to be happy with the results, our track record is abysmal. And unfortunately, we don't really have a scientific discipline for how to do this. So generally, we have all these scientific disciplines: AI, control theory, economics, operations, research, that are about how do you optimize an objective, but none of them are about, well, what should the objective be so that we're happy with the results. So that's really, I think, the modern understanding, as described in Bostrom's book and other papers, of why a superintelligent machine could be problematic. It's because if we give it an objective which is different from what we really want, then we're basically like creating a chess match with a machine. Right now, there's us with our objective and it with the objective we gave it, which is different from what we really want. So it's kind of like having a chess match for the whole world. And we're not too good at beating machines at chess. So
that's a great image, a chess match for the whole world. I want to drill down on a couple of things you just said there, because I'm hearing the skeptical voice even in my own head, even though I think I have smothered it over the last year of focusing on this. But it's amazingly easy, even for someone like me, and this was really kind of the framing of my TED Talk, where it's just, I was talking about these concerns and the value alignment problem, essentially. But the real message of my talk was that it's very hard to take this seriously emotionally, even when you are taking it seriously intellectually. There's something so diaphanous about these concerns, and they seem so far-fetched, even though you can't give an account, or I certainly haven't heard anyone give an account of why, in fact, they are far-fetched when you look closely at them. So, like, the idea that you could build a machine that is super intelligent and give it the instruction to cure cancer or fetch water, and not have anticipated that one possible solution to that problem was to kill all of humanity or to fetch the water from your own body. And that just seems, we have an assumption that things couldn't conceivably go wrong in that way. And I think the most compelling version of pushback on that front has come to me from people like David Deutsch, who you probably know. He's one of the father of quantum computing, or the concept there, a physicist at Oxford who's been on the podcast. He argues, and this is something that I don't find compelling, but I just want to put it forward, and I've told him as much. He argues that superintelligence entails an ethics. If we've built a superintelligent system, we will have given it our ethics to some approximation, but it will have a better ethics than ourselves, almost by definition. And to worry about the values of any intelligent systems we build is analogous to worrying about the values of our descendants or our future teenagers, where they might have different values, but they are an extension of ourselves. And now we're talking about an extension of ourselves that is more intelligent than we are across the board. And I could be slightly misrepresenting him here, but this is close to what he advocates, that there's something about that that should give us comfort, almost in principle, that there's just no, obviously we could stupidly build a system that's going to play chess for the whole world against us that is malicious, but we wouldn't do that. And what we will build is by definition going to be a more intelligent extension of the best of our ethics.
I mean, that's a nice dream, but as far as I can see, it's nothing more than that. There's no reason why the capability to make decisions successfully is associated with any particular goal structure or family of goal structures. So let me give you a much simpler example. Take a chessboard. You can look at a chessboard and you could say, well, the notion of checkmate is just kind of inherent in the chessboard, and any intelligent system would see from the chessboard and the shapes of the pieces that checkmate is the inherent objective of this game, and would therefore, learn to play chess and be an enjoyable chess partner for us. But this is completely false, because you can play regular chess or you can play suicide chess. And these are two completely, in some sense, opposite objectives. They're opposite definitions of what winning means in the game. And neither of them is inherent to the chessboard. And I can build a program to do either of these two things. So there's no sense in which objectives that would tend to produce behavior that we are happy with are just intrinsic to the world. Bacteria certainly don't think that, and viruses and so on. They just do whatever they do to achieve whatever they want, which evolution has created them to do. So it just seems like wishful thinking that has absolutely no causal basis, other than that you want it to be true. The fact that humans, talking about the analogy to our own descendants, so humans have evolved over, arguably hundreds of millions of years to function in a certain way. And one of the things that we have is we have built-in biological wiring that gives information about what is desirable. We don't like hunger, we don't like pain, we are drawn to pleasure and so on, and the desire to reproduce. These things are built in biologically. They're approximations to what we might think of as an evolutionary fitness function. And sometimes they're not very good approximations. For example, many of them can be satisfied by ingesting certain chemicals, and that usually does not lead to evolutionary fitness, even though it satisfies all, seems to satisfy all the biological wiring. So in some sense, we can short circuit and fool the drives that biology has built into us in a way that would be evolutionarily unfit. But we also have, I think, a way of learning about what our objectives are and should be from observing the behavior of other people around us. And this is a key idea that we've been using in our work on value alignment, which is the idea that when any intelligent entity behaves in the world, it's revealing information about its internal preference structure, about what it wants. And this is a very common sense idea, right? If you see me struggling out of bed and bleary-eyed going down to the kitchen and doing stuff with a machine that makes grinding and steamy noises and so on, and eventually I get myself a cup of coffee and I drink it, you can tell from all this behavior that's what I'm trying to do. I want to have a cup of coffee in the morning. And it's perfectly normal that as humans perceive each other, we are constantly trying to explain. I mean, this is sort of how, how the human mind works. We're always trying to explain what we perceive. And when we're perceiving intelligent behavior by others, we're internally explaining it in terms of objectives. And I think it's likely that the human species actually has a built-in process, not just for explaining the behavior of others in terms of objectives, but actually then assuming those objectives for ourselves as we grow up. So we internalize and then they become our own objectives because they are explaining the behavior of our peers and parents and so on. So, and I don't mean to say that this is the end of the story, but these two things, the biological wiring and this more social process, which people sometimes call cultural transmission of value system, but it's not necessarily cultural transmission by someone explaining to you, okay, these are the values of our culture, rule 1, rule 2, rule 3. This is much more pervasive process of observing and absorbing values from the behavior of everybody else in your society. So I think these processes are very complicated and they still don't work that well. I mean, from time to time, groups of humans sort of go off the deep end and end up with value systems that are highly inimical to the continued existence of the group. So they can become cultures that are very violent or nihilistic, and that doesn't end up well. Things don't go well for groups that develop those kinds of value systems.
But what about the related claim that we'll be safe because we will tether these super intelligent machines quite literally to our brains? We will essentially become the limbic system of these new machines, and therefore, by definition, their goals, both long-term and instrumental, will be anchored to our own value system. Do you see that as a durable basis for hope?
Not really. I do think that's a possible direction that we may see electronic enhancement of human cognition. And some people hold that out as a hope in the sense that we'll grow our own intelligence by electronic prosthesis, and that will enable us to compete in this chess match that people think of as inevitable.
And in fairness, I should say, I think that's David Deutsch's position as well. There'll be extensions of ourselves in every conceivable sense.
But we don't use machines currently that way. I mean, there are just lots and lots of machines. There are some machines that kind of are extensions of ourselves. Maybe my laptop is an extension. It sort of serves as an external memory and a remote communication device and so on. But when I think about a hydroelectric power station, I don't think it's not an extension of myself. It's a whole other thing. Bicycle is sort of an extension of myself, but is a jet aircraft and just an extension of me? No, I mean it's quite happy to fly around without me, or I could be a passenger in it. And I think we will have intelligent systems that are separate from our brains, physically separate. And we want that. We want robots that can, where we can say, okay, go into this coal mine and rescue the miners who are buried in some rockfall. There's all kinds of reasons why you want autonomy and not have only devices that are physically connected to our own brains. What I want to do actually is get away from this idea that we're forecasting. We're either forecasting doom or we're forecasting utopia. It seems that there are development paths we could follow that don't seem to have very good long-term prospects for the human race, and there are other paths that do. And I think what we have to do is find the paths that do have good long-term prospects for the human race. And that means understanding how to design AI systems so that they are highly capable, that they do the kinds of things that we want them to be able to do, but at the same time, that they remain fully under our control. And so this is the goal. So I have a new center that was funded by the Open Philanthropy Project. And so that's the goal of the center, is we're calling it provably beneficial AI systems. We would like, not sort of pious hopes that if we design things this way, it should be good. We actually want mathematical theorems saying that certain kinds of designs for AI systems are intrinsically safe. And oddly enough, it's quite easy to explain, in a sense, one key idea. So if you go back to what Wiener said, right, we better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire. So that's operating on the assumption that the only way to design an intelligent machine is that we formulate the objective and we put it into the machine. And that's precisely the source of the problem, right? That if we don't put exactly the right objective, and we really don't even know how to write it down properly, then we're going to have all these problems. But can you have useful machines where you don't put in a precise objective? And the answer seems to be yes. We want the machine, particularly because we don't even know ourselves really what our true objectives are and what will truly make us happy or not happy. At least we don't know it yet. Then we want the machine to be explicitly uncertain about the objective that the human has. The machine's goal is still to try to optimize it to help the human achieve whatever it is they really want. But the machine needs to be clear that it doesn't know what that is, or at least it doesn't know it precisely. And oddly enough, this sounds like a very simple idea, but it hasn't really been explored in the field. Because as I mentioned earlier, all these fields, AI, statistics, operations, research, control theory, they all assume that the objective is just something that's exogenously specified and is sort of by definition correct, and is put into the machine. And what I would argue is that assumption is false. And if we have machines that are uncertain about the objective, then they will behave in very different ways. For example, they will ask questions like, well, would it be a good idea if I did this? Or did you really mean that you want everything to turn to gold? Or, okay, how about, it doesn't sound right. It's not consistent with other things you said in the past. Maybe what you meant was just the things I point to and say abracadabra. Well, then I'll make those things turn into gold. But, you don't want your food and drink turning into gold, because then you'd be dead. And I'm pretty sure you don't want to be dead. Right? So that's the kind of conversation you want to have with the AI system. And it can only happen with an AI system that is explicitly uncertain about your objective. And you can tell it all kinds of things about what you want. And this is it's evident about what you really want, but it should never be taken as literal truth about what you want.
And by definition, it would remain perpetually open to your saying, that's not what I wanted, or that's not what I want, or that's not what I meant, so that you could keep, there'd be a brake to pull. It is somewhat counterintuitive. If you imagine building a truly super intelligent general AI, so that this is a mind that exceeds us in every capacity that we have, and the only difference is that we built it to serve us in some sense. Again, let's leave consciousness out of this and just assume that you can get human level intelligence and beyond without consciousness necessarily coming along for the ride. As you said at the outset, the existence of consciousness creates another problem, which we might want to talk about, but now we have an ethical obligation toward this super intelligent system that can be made happy or suffer or be deprived of happiness in ways that perhaps we can't even imagine. And I would argue that if we built a superhuman AI that was superhumanly conscious, well, we've just built something that is actually ethically of greater concern than we are, just as we're of greater concern than squirrels and crickets. But let's leave that aside. So we have a super intelligent artifact that we have no reason to think is conscious. But if it is in fact super intelligent across the board, I mean, what would that dialogue be like with our own goals and our own preferences? Because at some level, this thing, I mean, one of the reasons why we would want this thing is to tell us what we should want and how, like, to deepen our wants and goals so as to maximize human flourishing to a degree that may be currently unimaginable. And how do you keep a slave that is, in every respect, more competent to judge the wisdom of what you're doing than you are?
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. I mean, the notion of human flourishing is itself problematic. Who's to define what constitutes human flourishing? Some people might have visions of, conquering the universe, and others might have visions of, a stable, peaceful, dutiful agrarian existence. And who knows? And I think one point to make is that it would be nice to have a choice, as opposed to being driven by conflict, by limited resources, by these sort of inexplicable tides of history that sometimes just lead us to utter catastrophe. It would be nice to have a choice. How we make that choice, I can't tell you how we make that choice. But one thing that's clear to me, at least, is that one of the things humans value is autonomy, and a future where every decision is made by a machine, or every significant decision is made by a machine, and our material needs are all met. This doesn't feel to me like a desirable future. And it might be the case that what AI systems do for us in the long run is give us this freedom of choice to have some ability to shape our future and avoid these catastrophic problems that we frequently get ourselves into, but to some extent to stay largely in the background. So to give us freedom and help us understand, I think, what we do really want, but not to be constantly apparent for us. And so there's a story by E.M. Forster called "The Machine Stops," which I recommend to all your listeners. And it was written in 1909, I think, and it's an amazing story because it has the internet, it has basically iPads, video chat, it has MOOCs, massively online open courses. In fact, that's what most people do is give MOOC lectures and listen to MOOC lectures. And the machine, as it's called in the book, the machine sort of looks after everyone's material needs to the point where humans become enfeebled. They don't go outside anymore. They don't even bother visiting each other because they can do video chat. They become very, very effete. And in fact, even the sort of couch potato obesity is described in this 1909 story, which we think of as a very modern thing.
I'd heard of that. I've never read it, but I don't associate Forrester with an H.G. Wells' ability to predict the future.
It's truly amazing. In fact, I would say it's much more prescient than most of what H.G. Wells wrote. And so what happens to human society is that as a society becomes gradually more and more dependent on the machine until it cannot function independently at all, and gradually loses its like the de-skilling process that we talk about now with pilots, for example. The human society gradually loses its understanding of even how the machine works, and so when it stops working, the human race is in real trouble. So we clearly would want to avoid that kind of future. And if you ask me, what is the scenario? So Bostrom has his paperclip scenario where we accidentally tell a superintelligent machine to make paperclips, and it turns the whole planet into paperclips, or the Kansas scenario that I mentioned. So those are very simple, just thought experiments, just to illustrate the point that seemingly innocuous or even desirable goals by themselves can be arbitrarily bad. But if you ask me what is a likely scenario that we may follow that will lead us, into a dead end, it seems to me that this enfeeblement and de-skilling and gradual loss of autonomy is a much more likely scenario to occur. And we have to be vigilant against this. So if you've ever seen Wall-E, which is a very subversive movie, that's precisely the scenario that it's describing for the future of the human race, that we become enfeebled, obese, and completely dependent on machines that serve all of our material needs, and we lose autonomy almost completely.
Yeah, actually, I had another podcast guest, David Krakauer, who runs the Santa Fe Institute. He has this concept of two different types of cognitive artifacts, cooperative ones and competitive ones. The cooperative ones actually make us better even in their absence. His example is that if you learn to use an abacus, you actually become better at calculating even without the abacus. You can internalize the abacus and you can do calculations that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And language is a cooperative artifact. And there's things that, the concept of numbers are things that we have invented that we can internalize, whether or not they're actually devices in the world. And yet there are other things that are cognitively competitive artifacts that we get worse because we have delegated all of this operation to a machine or to some other artifact, which when it breaks down, we no longer know how to do the thing we used to know how to do perfectly well, whether it's a long division or anything else, flying planes.
Yeah.
Driving cars is in the very near term something we're going to, probably to the benefit of tens of thousands of lives every year, we will blissfully forget how to drive cars at some point because it will be irresponsible to drive your own car once robot cars are truly safe. You could argue that even without AI, the internet is already almost there in terms of if this machine stops, it's hard to picture what would happen to a society like the United States with an internet outage that lasted 6 months. I mean, do you think we are already fatally dependent on our technology long before we've birthed superintelligent AI?
I don't know about fatally, but certainly very dependent. I mean, our economy would almost collapse. I think we would muddle through.
Yeah, we'd be squarely in some sort of dystopia for a good long while.
Yes, I think we would see possibly starvation in cities. The complete termination of a large fraction of industrial production and transportation systems and so on. I mean, you see this, when an airline's online reservation systems goes down, they end up having to cancel tens of thousands of flights if it goes down for several days. So, yeah, I think this is just a small example of something that we need, and how do we avoid this? Because, it's always easier to take the instantaneous convenience without thinking about the loss of autonomy that it entails.
And before you suffer any consequences of lost autonomy, you would have the immense power of having successfully delegated your apish operations to a superintelligent AI. So the community that decides, well, I just want intelligence at my beck and call, that community will be far more powerful than, by comparison, a kind of Luddite, kind of the Amish of the future, where they're trying to maintain their autonomy in the face of all of these immense computational resources. There's another dystopian wrinkle here, which I talked about in my TED Talk, which is even if everything goes exactly as we would want it to go, so it's as though we're just handed a perfectly obedient, benevolent, superintelligent AI, you could still see things going spectacularly wrong for us because we are not economically or politically poised to absorb this perfect labor-saving device, because this is a wealth creation device of a sort that has never existed. It can design the machine, that can build the machine, that can do anything. It can replace any human labor, not just drudgery, but the sort of labor that you and I do. So, in a perfect world, we would then all be free to just enjoy ourselves in every way that we want and to have those pleasures be supported, perfected, protected by increasingly powerful labor-saving technology. And so we'd be playing frisbee in the park and no one would have to justify their existence by working because there would be more wealth than we could ever consume just pulled out of the ether by these superhuman machines. But of course, we are nowhere near ready, apparently, to share this wealth in this way. What I pictured, somewhat of a cartoon, but I pictured, would have trillionaires on the covers of our business magazines, and 50% unemployment in the United States. So that there's a bottleneck there that we have to figure out how to negotiate. Even if we were given a perfect version of this technology, which, as you've already said, is by no means guaranteed, we need the political and economic mechanisms to use this gift for the benefit of all humanity. And I don't really see many people thinking about how to do that.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the beginning of another hour's conversation, at least, to talk about the effect on the economy and employment. And I'm not one of those who says, well, we've had these technological revolutions before, and we'll have them again, and we always figure out new jobs for people to do, because as you say, if the machine can now replace not just the physical labor of the human, and very few humans are, relatively speaking, are involved in physical labor compared to what was the situation in the 19th century. And if you also replace the mental labor, then what is left? There isn't just an infinite supply of new capabilities that humans have that they can use for employment. So I think briefly, one thing that humans have is the fact that they're human, and the fact that other humans value the attention, the company, the services of human beings. And as long as that's true, then there can still be useful roles. But the kind of society and economy that entails, if it's not to be, as you described, a very thin elite supported by a somewhat thicker layer of personal servants, and then everyone else, 95% of the population being essentially unemployed, just fed and housed and entertained and left to play frisbee. That to me is a terrible future for the human race. So on both of these fronts, one being, how do we think about the value of our autonomy in the future, and the other being, how do we construct a functioning society in the presence of these kinds of capabilities? I think there's a limited amount that the technocrats, the AI researchers and roboticists and so on, or even the economists can do. I think it has to be a cultural process. A huge amount of cultural work has to be done to work through all these questions, and first of all, to give people understanding of what the questions are. And I think, for example, movies are doing a good job of this.
Are there any movies that you think get these concerns right? I mean, what's the most compelling vision of, whether it's utopian or dystopian, that you've seen?
So I think there are bits and pieces of the story that are done well in different movies. So I think Transcendence gets across the idea of intelligence explosion and kind of the sense of humanity losing control in the face of a much more intelligent machine. Some other parts of the plot are a bit less excellent, but it has excellent aspects. I think Ex Machina gives you a very clear sense of the, as we were talking about earlier, the black box of a system that is very intelligent, but you really have no idea how it's working or what its objectives are or what's going on. And in a very sort of one-on-one sense, it's like the chess match idea, except in microcosm.
Let's linger on that for a second, because that displayed a property of an intelligent system, which I think many people find totally counterintuitive. The idea that an intelligent machine we would build might lie to us or manipulate us to meet its own goals, or to even meet goals we've given it, but it sees another way of meeting them. Is there a reason to think that manipulation on the part of superhuman AI is implausible in principle?
No, not at all. we have poker playing programs that bluff. So in some sense, they lie to us to beat us at poker.
Mm. It seems to fall right out of just having goals in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, deception. I mean, kids learn this at a fairly early age. They have goals and they lie in order to achieve them.
Mm.
They say, "Oh no, I haven't seen the candy, Daddy. I have no idea where it is." No, I think a lot of the stories that people, whether it's lay people or the AI community, tell themselves in order not to have to worry about it, are just stories. And I recently wrote a paper where I listed about 15 of the arguments that have come out of the AI community as to why there is no reason to be concerned.
Mm.
And when you look at these, they all have the flavor of a kind of a fright response, a knee-jerk kind of denial, and the arguments are just not worthy of the people who are making them. And I think there are arguments which say that superintelligent AI is a long way off, and as yet we don't have much sense of what it will be like, what shape it will have at all. And so it's hard to know what to do, even if you acknowledge that potentially one kind of superintelligent AI system could present a risk to the human race. But I think that's a legitimate line of argument. But I think our research suggests that, in fact, even in the absence of any details about what the systems will be like, we can start to do work that will allow us to construct templates that, unlike more classical kinds of optimizing of objectives, do seem to be potentially safe. They clearly have better properties from the point of view of you remaining in control and avoiding these misalignment issues.
The reason why the time horizon for me is a deeply uninteresting and unconsoling thing to reference is twofold. One is that there's a quote I used of yours in my TED Talk, which suggests that we have, under different descriptions, a very different response to certain blocks of time. So I mean, you said, I believe this quote originates with you, but I think it first appeared in the article you wrote jointly with Max and Stephen Hawking in a British paper. But I think I've heard you use it. I think you used it at the conference we were at in Puerto Rico a couple years ago.
Uh-huh.
The idea that if we received an email, I think you said, from a alien civilization, and it said, "People of Earth, we will arrive on your planet in 50 years. Get ready," we would be far more motivated than we are when we hear a technologist denying that there's a problem here because it's going to take at least 50 years to develop. So 50 years is just not that much time once you imagine this thing actually arriving on a certain day. But the other problem for me is that, let's say we knew it was going to be 50 years or 100 years. We still don't know how long it will take us to do it safely. I mean, that's only consoling on the proposition that it only takes you 49 years to do this safely. So you've got enough time to do it safely.
So and the other thing is that, with for example, the aliens who say they're going to be 50 years, or an asteroid where you can calculate the collision time, achieving superintelligent AI requires breakthroughs that can happen overnight. And an example I often give in talks is what happened with nuclear physics, where the physics establishment, as embodied, for example, by Rutherford, who was probably the leading nuclear physicist of his time, was convinced that even though they knew there was a massive amount of energy locked up in the atom, they were convinced that there was no way to release it. And Rutherford gave a famous speech on September 11th, 1933, where he said that anyone who talks about this possibility is talking moonshine. And then the next morning, Leo Szilard figured out the key idea, which is a chain reaction that's mediated by neutrons. So the nuclear chain reaction. So it went from never to less than 24 hours.
Literally the next morning. That's a sobering analogy.
So I would say, it's hard to quantify these things, but I think we need about half a dozen breakthroughs of that magnitude to get to something that we would call general AI. It's very hard to predict, but given the rate of investment, the massive concentration of intellectual resources into the field right now, and the fact that progress seems to be accelerating, one problem after another is being knocked down that has been problems of decades of work. Yeah, it doesn't give me much optimism to say, well, we're still a long way off. And what I am seeing, one of the arguments that I'm seeing in the AI community, of the 15 that I mentioned, one that seems to be cropping up quite often is, well, don't worry, because in fact, human level AI is impossible. So we can't ever get there. And it's like, well, the AI community has been saying exactly the opposite for the last 60 years, that philosophers have been saying that AI is impossible. And the AI community has been saying, no, it's not impossible, and you're just confused and old-fashioned, and absolutely human-level AI is possible.
Well, the argument that it's impossible presupposes that there is something magical about a computer made of meat, or that there's something that our brains are doing that is something that cannot be mediated in any other physical system or any physical system we are going to build.
Sam, is not as complicated as that. They present no justification whatsoever for it being impossible, other than, well, if it's impossible, I don't have to worry about it. So I'm just going to assume it's impossible, right? And it's so inconsistent with our own history as a field, and it comes with absolutely no technical justification whatsoever, even of the magical kind, that it can only be a form of denial, and that's disappointing to me.
Is this paper of yours available online now? Can I link to it on my blog from where I embed this podcast?
Not yet, no, but it's in press. I think it will come out. It's a chapter in a book that will come out probably early next year.
Okay.
So I just wanted to say one more thing that people may want to watch, which is the TV series called Humans, which comes from I think Channel 4 in the UK. And to me, that gives a very clear accounting of the kinds of sociological issues, so relating to employment, sense of purpose, autonomy, and so on, that would arise. In the series, the assumption is that we've created effectively human level, not particularly superhuman, but human level intelligence embodied in very physically realistic androids. They look very much like human beings, and so it's very, very interesting. It's very much done not in a sort of a giant sci-fi style, but in looking at a one family, the people in the family, the particular android who works with the family, and so on. I mean, there is a larger plot which you'll have to watch the series to find out about. But I think it's quite excellent in describing the very practical day-to-day adjustments of human society to the presence of these intelligent robots.
You've been great. You've been very generous with your time, and sorry about the lost sleep.
That's my own.
Briefly, tell us, are you on social media? Is there any web address or Twitter account you want people to know about?
So my webpage, the easiest thing is just to type my name into Google, and that'll take you straight to my webpage.
It'll be on my blog as well. Thanks again, Stuart. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Sam.
Before I close here, I'd like to thank those of you who've begun supporting the podcast. This has allowed me to spend more time doing it, and it also has inspired me to begin thinking creatively about how I could make this a more substantial project. And this could entail many things. It could entail renting a studio where I can do more of these interviews face-to-face rather than over Skype, which would improve them significantly. It might allow me to hire a producer who could bring a level of professionalism to this that I can't seem to muster on my own. When I listen to podcasts like Serial or any of these other highly produced shows, there are aspects to that I would like to be able to emulate here. I could hire a researcher that could help me move into new content areas. And I could even produce live events associated with the podcast. This sort of thing becomes possible once this achieves a stable basis of support. So if you've begun helping in that way, please know how much I appreciate that. And if you'd like to help, you can do that at samharris.org/support. Or you can support the podcast on a per-episode basis through patreon.com/samharris. And again, many thanks. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast, or you can support it directly at samharris.org/support.